about, well, they gave me this title, Eco Church and the Baptist Union Environment Network. So we're going to talk about the environment and climate change and how it relates to church life. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been in ministry now 20 years, since I went to college, which I know for some of you is not very long. I've been at my current church for 12 years, and I stood down as senior minister last summer to go part-time. So for the last year I've been part-time, and I do work around the environment and climate change with churches, and also around science and faith with churches and schools in various ways. And actually I've just announced I'm leaving at the end of April, and kind of stepping back from local church ministry to focus again on science and faith and the environment. My background before going into ministry, I used to work at the Met Office, building climate models and weather forecasting models. So I normally say you can believe everything I say in the next hour, at least for about 12 hours looking ahead. So we're going to talk about the environment and climate change, and in a little while I'd like to get your views on these things, where you're at with that. But just to start you off, there's one other thing you need to know about me, in that I'm an addict. I grew up an addict, and I grew up, not only my family were addicts, but my entire community were addicts. And it's just a normal part of life. And actually, we weren't just addicts ourselves, we supplied other communities too. We were big suppliers, and we thought nothing of it. They wanted the stuff, we gave them the stuff. And you might think I look pretty healthy for an addict. But actually what I was addicted to, what my family, what my community were addicted to, was this. Coal. I grew up in Nottinghamshire, in the North Nottinghamshire coalfield. My grandfather was a miner. His children, my father and his brother, and none of the rest of the family ever went down the pits. But a lot of my contemporaries did on leaving school. It was a major employer in the area.
If you don't hold on to the bottom of the microphone,
Is that better?
Then it'll be fine.
Okay. So, we dug this out the ground in my community, and we burnt it on our fires. I remember as a kid making the fire, coming down in the morning, laying the fire with the newspaper and the fire lighters. That was how we heated our hot water. And this is a picture of where I grew up. This is Kirkby in Ashfield, Nottinghamshire, in the 1960s. Sorry, it's not a great picture. I had to take it looking through the glass of a picture I had by my bed, just to remind me where I came from. But that's the engine sheds where my granddad worked. That's where they did a lot of coal loading and delivery, next to Kirkby Pit, Summit Pit. The first house I ever lived at, when I was brought home from hospital, was one of those houses by the engine sheds. I used to drive trains in the engine sheds. My granddad used to take me every now and again to do that. But you might notice over that entire town, there's this kind of greyness, and that's smoke from coal fires. And, it wasn't a clean place, it wasn't a particularly healthy place at times. You put your washing out on the lines, it used to get covered in soot and coal dust. And it's a lot pleasanter now, because we don't burn coal there anymore. And, London had its own issues with smog as well, right into the 1950s with burning coal. And the Clean Air Acts cleaned up the air right across the country in the major cities. I mean, there are other issues as well with air pollution in London due to the particulates you get in your traffic in the air, which you don't see as easily as the smog due to coal dust. But something else you don't see is the gas that burning coal, oil and gas produces, and that's carbon dioxide. So we have been reliant on fossil fuels now in our society since the mid-1800s and even before. And we have found that during that time, the Earth has started to warm. So this is, I like this, this is a really neat way of showing what's happening to the planet. This is the temperature of the Earth. It's a bit like a barcode in a supermarket. Every stripe is a year, and every year is colour-coded. Blue, colder than average in that period. Red, warmer than average. And gradually, as we've measured the temperature since the mid-1850s, when we could do it globally, we've seen, especially in the last 50 years, the planet begin to warm at faster and faster rates. And at the moment, we're about 1 degree warmer than we were in 1850, about 1.2, 1.1 to 1.2. And that's because we burn fossil fuels, we put 50% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is a very powerful gas. It's a bit like wrapping the Earth in a continental quilt. It warms the planet, acts to warm the planet by about 30 degrees naturally, and you add a little bit more, and it will begin to warm, and that's what's been happening. And you'll probably be aware that before Christmas in November, there was a big conference in Glasgow. The nations of the world got together for the 26th time to try and decide what to do about this problem. And there are choices to make. If we do nothing, and we carry on as we are, by the end of this century, the Earth will be 5 degrees warmer. The North Pole will be ice-free. Major glaciers will have melted, and probably some ice sheets on the South Pole will have started to disintegrate. Storms, floods, droughts, massive shifts in weather patterns will affect human populations and also other forms of life as well. Sea level rise about 0.5 metre to 1 metre by the end of the century, which means London, which seems very secure, is vulnerable to that kind of sea level rise, especially when you get storms coming down the North Sea. And the Thames Barrier will cope until I think about 2030, 2040, and then something will need to be done to stop London flooding. That's if we do nothing. The science tells us that if we keep the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, and there's nothing we can do at this point to stop climate change, it's going to happen in some measure. If we can keep it to 1.5 degrees, some of the worst aspects of climate change on people and the rest of life on the planet can be avoided or mitigated against. The COP26 meeting was trying to figure out ways to do that. We know if we're going to keep it to 1.5 degrees, then basically by 2050 we have to stop adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, preferably before that. And nations have gradually been making promises over the last 5 years over how they're going to tackle this, how they're going to put less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Before COP, the promises that were being made would have meant the Earth would have warmed by about 3 degrees, which is still too much. After COP, we're down to 2.5 degrees, if every country meets its promises. And actually, so far, they've not been very good at doing that. So we've still got a long way to go, although there were some good things about COP, there were some bad things about COP. But there's more that needs to be done. So this is a global problem, and when is the Baptist Union Environment Network, which I kind of coordinate nationally, and we're trying to raise the profile of this issue amongst our churches and encourage churches to play their part in addressing it. So we want to inspire local churches, associations, our colleges, and our central resource as well. We want to enable churches to recognise the goodness of God's creation, and we do that to some extent. We use wonderful images in our worship as backdrops to our PowerPoints with our songs about the wonder of creation. I wish they wouldn't, because they're very distracting, especially the ones of stars and planets, which I love. So we recognise the goodness, the majesty, the beauty of God's creation. But sometimes it just passes us by. It's something that's there, but it doesn't really engage us in terms of action. So we want to kind of recognise it more deeply. And we want to help churches to understand that mission actually involves joining with God in sustaining and caring for creation. That's a phrase which has become quite commonplace in theology and mission agencies, caring for creation. But what does that actually mean in practice for us in local churches? We want to explore that together. And we want to work for justice, for creation and for people impacted by climate change. So people are already being impacted by storms and droughts And you will have seen the pictures of those massive forest fires in Australia and North America and the Mediterranean, even over into Siberia, where last year they had a massive heat wave beyond anything they'd ever experienced before. So that's what Gwen is trying to do, to inspire the Baptist Together network to engage with this issue. It's a global problem, and London, it strikes me, is a global city. Although often it feels like a community of villages to me as well. A little bit disconnected with what goes on in the centre. But you are a global city in many, many ways. And I wonder where you're at the moment with this issue, in terms of your own agenda, your church's agenda, your community's agenda. Because I know what it's like being a minister. There's lots of things to think about, isn't there? Your mission, buildings, people, needs of the community, worship, preaching, people, pastoral care, environment. You know, I get loads of stuff through my letterbox from different groups and agencies. I have to say most of it goes into recycling because I don't have time to read it. So your kind of agenda is full as a minister. So where does the environment, where does climate change fit in your church, in your thinking? Where does it fit in your community's thinking? So why don't you have a chat with you now from every group? Why is this important for churches, especially in London? You live in a global city. You are connected. I mean, you're the only global city in the United Kingdom, really. I mean, the other cities might complain about that, but I think it's true. Population-wise, you're much bigger than any other city in the United Kingdom. You're one of the biggest cities in Europe, you're right. You have these global connections through business, through politics, through transport. And you also have, ethnicity-wise, you are a very diverse global community. Huge components from Asia, from Africa and the Caribbean live in London. And also still a significant number of European people live in the city as well. So you have all these global links through people, through business, through politics, through transport and travel. You also have a huge carbon footprint as a city. Everybody in London is responsible for between 10 and 12 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. That's higher than the UK national average. And it's not that you necessarily produce it all locally, because you don't have much heavy industry and you don't have many power plants locally, but because of these connections you have and bringing goods in to support the population, and the business that you stimulate, not only in the UK but around the world, if you tally up all the carbon budget associated with that, it comes up to 10 to 12 tonnes, which is a lot. In England, the average is about 8 now. So as a city, you have a big carbon footprint. And that's large compared to some of the countries around the world who get the blame for climate change. So here are some big countries in the world. If you live in China, on average, every Chinese person is responsible for 6 tonnes of carbon dioxide. Actually, 20 years ago, they only made 2 tonnes per person. So they have been rapidly industrialising over the last 20 years. America is responsible for 17 tonnes. Every American responsible for 17 tonnes. If you live in a city, it'll be larger than that, but they like to fly, and they like air conditioning, and they like inefficient cars still. So they have a huge carbon footprint. And one of the difficulties of climate change is kind of who's going to blink first with the major countries of the world. Is it the Americans blame the Chinese, because the Chinese actually produce half of the world's carbon dioxide at the moment because they've got a huge population. The Chinese look at the Americans and say, you've been doing it for 100 years, we've only been doing it for 10. So it's your responsibility to jump first. And this is one of the problems why it's taken 26 years, 26 meetings global meetings about climate change to make a little bit of progress. And for the first time this time, they actually mentioned coal, oil and gas in the final document, saying these were the problems. Before that, they never mentioned them before. And while the big nations of the world are debating this, other nations in the world are feeling the impacts. And some of them you will be connected to as a city. So Ghana, I was talking to one of your colleagues from Tottenham over coffee, comes from Ghana. If you live in Ghana, you produce 1 tonne of carbon dioxide a year. If you live in Nigeria on average, it'll be larger in Lagos and the cities, you produce 1 tonne of carbon dioxide a year. And yet these are countries in Africa, in the tropics, in the Far East, in the Pacific. These are the countries that start to feel the impacts of climate change before we do. And actually people live much more marginal lives in these countries. David?
Dave, do you know where India fits? Because India's quite a big producer, isn't it?
India is a big producer of carbon dioxide, again, because they're a big population. I think it's about 4 tonnes per person now in India. They are rapidly industrialising. And they use a lot of coal. And at COP, India were reluctant to stop using coal. So it looked like until at tea time on the final day, on the Saturday of the meeting, it looked like they were going to talk about phasing out coal. But the Indians objected. And so we ended up with the phrase phase down coal, which, is a step forward, but not enough. But yeah, it's a big problem. But they also have big problems in their cities with air pollution because of the use of coal. So eventually they may have to do something more rapidly.
David, sorry,
Yeah.
are you able to tell us about our sort of near neighbours with similar economies, like Germany,
Yep,
big users of coal
Yeah.
and gas,
yep.
and France, who are actually very nuclear?
Very nuclear. So I'm not sure what the figures are for France, but I would expect them to be a low carbon footprint than us. Germany probably higher because they still use a lot of coal.
Yeah.
Poland much higher because they use a lot of coal. But I guess on average Europe would be around 6 to 10 tonnes per person. So we're still quite high compared to a lot of the world, really. I mean, the Stern report, this was a report produced by Lord Stern at London School of Economics 15 years ago on the economics of climate change and the impacts of climate change. And he comes up with this statement in there that actually the poorest countries of the world will suffer the most and earliest, and they already are. But they're the least responsible for climate change. So there's an issue of justice here. Yeah.
We're faced also with the challenge not just of reducing CO2 emissions,
Yeah.
but how adequately to offer recompense to those whose lives, often in poorer countries,
Yes.
depend on carbon fuels in the way that yours did or your parents did in Nottinghamshire and my parents did in South Wales.
It's a big issue, and I mean, and there's dilemmas for a country like Ghana and Nigeria, in that they sell oil, but they need to sell oil to fund this infrastructure, provide education, healthcare for their population. So there's a real dilemma. So there are mechanisms in the international agreements. The rich countries of the world are supposed to provide $100 billion a year to the poorer countries in the world to transition away from fossil fuels. They're still struggling to meet that target. At the moment it's 80 billion. It was supposed to be 100 billion by 2020. It's now supposed to be 100 billion by 2023. And also there's a big push from the developing world for the rich countries of the world provide finance for what's called loss and damage. So this is reparations. In the same way that there's pressure for the countries that suffered under the slave trade to provide reparations from the West who drove that. There's pressure from the developing countries to the rich countries to provide finance to compensate them for the damage they're already feeling from climate change. No country apart from Scotland has given any money to that yet. And some countries are definitely saying no, we're not going to do that, including ours. So there are big issues of justice around this which are really hard to solve at the moment, especially in such a divided world. A couple of other things why it's important to London. Londoners care about it. So these are some facts from a survey done by the London Assembly. 80% of Londoners are concerned about climate change. And 61% say that they take account climate change in their day-to-day decisions. That might be what they buy, how they travel, how they heat their homes, things like that. So the questions are being asked about how do you make living in London more sustainable into the future. So people in your community are concerned about this. But there's also anxiety as well. 50% of Londoners are anxious about how this is going to be affordable. And there are big questions to ask about that, because some of the things that are being suggested that you can do to mitigate climate change costs a lot of money. Changing your heating systems, getting an electric car. And if you're living in a rented accommodation, a lot of London's population do, in some ways there's little often you can do to take steps to reduce your carbon footprint. If it's all down to your landlord to change your heating system and insulate your homes. So there are some issues in London itself about justice between the rich and the poor in London. The richer part of the population can afford to do something. The poorer part of the population find it much more difficult to respond to this. And another reason why, as London Baptist churches, you might be concerned about this, is London's a very young city. The kind of median age in London is 36. Nationally, it's 40. And that's quite a big difference statistically. And there's a large amount of anxiety around climate change in the environment in the young, in the under 35s. Climate anxiety is quite a big thing. I was talking to a psychologist in the summer. I walked with some young Christians who were walking from London to Glasgow to the climate summit, and I walked with them for a day, and I ended up talking with a Christian who works as a psychologist at the London School of Tropical Hygiene, and I was asking him about climate anxiety, and he said there are two types of it. In the developing world, it's often the anxiety actually of what climate change is going to do to your next cycle of crops, and whether you'll have enough food to eat next year. In the West, especially amongst the young, the anxiety is about what is the world going to look like in 20, 30 years' time. And what will it be like to live in? So there's a huge amount of climate anxiety amongst young people. And interestingly, there's a lot of activism amongst young people. Issues of justice really grab younger age groups. I think this is something you were hearing about this morning amongst the under 30s, are much more action orientated. I was talking to somebody, a Baptist minister the other week, about climate change. He was telling me that their daughter is a member of XR and has gone on some of their training programs to know how to do peaceful protesting. And they're much more activist orientated, this younger generation. And you're seeing that in London and in the large cities especially. Much more activist than actually my generation or even older. A lot of XR actually are older than me. And I'm 60. So there's some of the reasons why actually this might be an issue you might want to think about as Baptist churches in London. But I wonder, what are some of the barriers that there are for this, do you think, in your church communities? And actually, what are some of the possibilities as well, thinking about the kind of city you're living in? What are some of the barriers and what are some of the openings that you might have in your churches in communities? So time to have a chat again. So get back together and just have a chat for a few minutes. What kind of barriers are you finding and what kind of opportunities might there be as well? That's really helpful. Great feedback, some really good points people have made there. How we talk about this in our churches can make a difference as well in terms of engaging our churches with it. So here are 4 ways you can talk about the environment and climate in your churches. One of the major ways we have talked about this is as a justice issue. And in fact, at the Baptist Assembly this year, Bwen is involved in a session on global justice issues. And we're speaking about climate and the environment as a justice issue. So we do that. And it is a justice issue, as we've discussed, between the rich nations of the world, the poor nations of the world, between the rich in our society and the poor in our society. There are justice issues around it. It's just that sometimes this doesn't connect, especially with the evangelical churches these days. It's really important, but I think there's a frustration at times from those people who talk in these terms, especially from the mission agencies who have championed this approach and talking about justice, that it does not always connect with our church. And that might be true about racial justice and economic justice and gender justice as well. Another major way that we've been talking about this for the last 20 years is in terms of stewardship. We have a part to play in caring for creation, joining with God's mission to care for creation. And I think that's a really important metaphor. We kind of draw it from those early stories in Genesis about the creation of the world, although you have to do some pretty fancy theological footwork to get from dominion to stewardship, to be honest. But there are stories and pictures in the Old Testament about looking after the land, the laws of looking after the land. I wonder how that fits into an urban environment, when actually a lot of your people don't have land and gardens, perhaps, if you're living in flats and things like that. And I think there are some other questions we can ask about stewardship as well. It's okay stewarding your garden or an allotment or a field, but actually stewarding a planet is quite difficult to get your head around. What do you need to do to keep the planet healthy is an ongoing question that we're still trying to understand. And that seems to be a big thing anyway, doesn't it? Beyond each of our individual capabilities. We don't always talk about redemption when it comes to the environment, although you've mentioned Tom Wright, who would talk about redemption, about the new heaven and the new earth as the trajectory that God is working towards. Redemption for us as evangelicals and as Baptists often is about personal salvation, about what Jesus did for you and others on the cross. But actually the New Testament has these statements in, especially in Colossians, that God reconciled to himself all things through Jesus' blood shed on the cross. And maybe in our preaching about redemption and our understanding of redemption and teaching about it, then we need to broaden its scope beyond the individual to this wider understanding of the wider world, including the environment and nature. So that's perhaps a journey we need to go on. I was at London School of Theology a few weeks ago talking about how to use science experiments in church with the students and the staff there, which is another kind of string to my bow with Messy Church. And I got asked a question by one of the students, a second year student, who'd been on placement with us the year before. And his question was, do you think churches are talking too much about the environment? Shouldn't be focusing on preaching the gospel? And I thought that encapsulates what I just said in a nutshell. How do we talk about redemption? Isn't caring for creation part of the gospel? And then finally, and I don't think we talk about this enough, about relationship with nature, with creation. One thing I think science has taught us over the last 50 or 100 years is the world is a very interconnected place. Life is an incredibly interconnected place. I was reading a novel about trees and people who are trying to protect trees in the United States. And there's a lot of science in that novel about how trees are connected together via their root systems, often by networks of fungus, who supply nutrients between the trees. It's almost like your circulation system in the body, the blood circulation system or the nervous system. There's this connection between trees in a forest and connection between different species in a forest. And in some ways we are connected to creation. And I think we understand as Baptists, perhaps more than some other streams in the church, the importance of relationship for church, because our idea of church is about relationship, people being in relationship. So we have this idea of being covenant communities, locally, but also across our associations. This is the London Baptist Confession of 1644. A church is defined as a company of visible saints joined to the Lord and to each other. That's who we are as a church. That's one of the theological innovations that Baptists came up with, this idea of extending the idea of covenant between people and God and people and each other as well as God, this triangular relationship. But maybe we need a bigger picture of covenant. Maybe we need to include creation into our idea of covenant. This is actually something that was written by an environmentalist in the States, a Christian environmentalist. Wendell Berry is a farmer who said this back in the 80s. Humans are creatures of God, members of the holy community of creation, inextricably joined to each other, indebted to each other, receiving significance and worth from each other. Sounds like a church. Sounds like the one another community of the church, and yet he's talking about humans and the environment, the creation. Yeah, I've been thinking about it for over 30 years, and I still haven't quite grasped it yet. But I think you're right, there is a hint there. There is something in there about redemption, our relationship to creation there. But you also find at the end of the story of Noah and the flood, when God says to Noah, I'm making a covenant with you and your descendants and every living thing in creation. So there's God's relationship, not just with human beings, but this wider relationship with the rest of the living world in which we are a part as well. So maybe there's something here that enables us as covenant communities to understand we have a relationship much wider than just human beings together in a location. That's something.
You say, David, at the end of the book of Jonah, where it mentions all about the cattle and the...
Yeah.
You know, I shouldn't just be concerned about 120,000
Yeah.
Ninevites.
The cattle and the
And
livestock as well.
What?
Yeah. It's there, but we haven't always seen it, included it into our thinking. I think there's some work to be done on the idea of Baptist theology of the environment based on covenant community, actually. That might be interesting. Time's moving on. So, just a little bit about Buen. We've been having conversations in most of our associations over the last year, mostly by Zoom. Actually, this is one of the rare in-person conversations I've had over the last 18 months since we launched Buen in the start of the autumn in 2020. And in a lot of our associations now, we have groups of people or small individuals who are working with associations to kind of raise this issue at association levels. They're all doing different kind of things. Over in WebNet, they are looking at actually adopting an environmental policy for the association. In the East Midlands, they've been running seminars on a Roche's Eco Church programme and sharing ideas around that, about how you can get involved in that and how that's useful to change church life. Up in the northwest, when they launched up there, we had a concert, a worship concert with Resound Sound and their Doxicology album, which is an album that came out in 2020 of worship songs around creation and environment and the environmental crisis. Really interesting and helpful album, music in worship. We've used some of them in our church. So they're all doing their own things, shaped according to how their association works. I'd love if we could have a group in the LBA as well. Just start to think about what this issue means for your association, for your churches, and just encouraging churches to think about it. It's a slow process, it's a slow burn, but that's the kind of things that we're encouraging to see happening in our churches. And this year at the Assembly, we've got one presentation around climate justice, and we also hopefully have a photographic exhibition of large photographs of different aspects of the environment linked to reflections around wonder, playfulness, God's playfulness in creation, and God bringing creation to unity together. So that's another way we're exploring, trying to connect people with this issue. I think it's well, it's an issue that goes across all of our priorities as Baptists together. One of our priorities is voicing in the public square that we start to engage with wider society. And this is an issue we can engage with wider society on. We can join national, international campaigns to make a difference here. And as a Baptist Union, nearly 2 years ago, a year ago, about 18 months ago now, we joined up with a campaign called Bright Now, and we agreed we'd divest all of our BU funds in fossil fuels, in extraction, development and production of fossil fuels. So none of the Baptist Union funds are now invested in those industries. That was a big step forward, and I know some of our associations have also had that conversation too. But it goes beyond this kind of justice and campaigning issue. As we've said, it comes down to understanding what's it mean for our leadership as ministers of churches, and how we're shaping people for leadership for the future. It's about explaining and exploring this wider gospel that's there in the Bible. And I'd love to tell you Eco Alpha is a new version of the Alpha course, discipleship course, which has a larger component of creation care in it. It's not, actually. It's an environmental consultancy in California. It's just their logo. But I think that'd be interesting to develop a discipleship course around, not just around creation care, but exploring that as part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus today. You can get involved in mission globally. BMS are spinning up their creation care program. They've even got a carbon calculator on their website now, which you can use to offset your travel or your church heating and things like that, gas. But there are opportunities, like you were discussing, about connecting with local communities. So where I live in Croxley Green, it's a big village, 12,000 people. We have a group there called Green Croxley. It was actually started by the schools, the 5 primary schools and the 2 secondary schools that we have. And they're environmental groups. They've all got environmental groups. They've all got environmental champions. And they formed the group Green Croxley. And they invited other people in the community to join them. So 2 churches are involved. The parish council is involved, and a couple of local businesses are involved. And that is... on Earth Day last year, that's some of the 300 children and parents who turned out after school with some people from the churches to pick up litter in the village for an hour and a half. There are ways to build relationships between churches and community around this issue. And I think we need to start to think about what this means as we think about the future of the church. This was a really book I read in a sabbatical a year ago called Rewilding the Church. Anybody read this book? It's about pioneering, really, and fresh expressions. It's a really stimulating, interesting read, and the author drew a lot on ecology and the understanding of the interconnectedness of nature to describe the church. It was a really interesting read, but it was really frustrating, because it was all metaphor to explore different ways of being church. There wasn't that much in it about how, as Christians, we need to be engaging with this issue around the environment. And I think we need to go deeper than metaphor into some kind of action and letting this reshape our life. 2 ways we've been encouraging churches to engage with this over the past year is to hold a Climate Sunday, hold a service around creation care, or a series on creation care in their churches. Another way you can begin to engage is through the Eco Church program of Arusha. This is a really good and simple web-based program which allows you to start looking at your environmental impact as a church. My church has just got its Bronze Awards. It's fairly straightforward and simple to do. It's an online questionnaire. And it gives you a foundation to start thinking about this more widely in your church. Before you rush into solar panels and heat pumps and big changes, this enables you to see little changes that may seem more possible with finances and what people are willing to commit to, but it starts you on the journey. So I'd commend that to you. It's a good program to engage with. And just finally, that's Gwen's webpage with some resources on the BU website. We've also got a Facebook page as well where we put more up-to-date information, and that's our email address, and those emails come through to me. So if you want more information or you want to chat about anything, ask a question, just email that address and we'll try and respond as soon as we can. But this seems a big thing, as we've talked about. And one of the things I learnt as a weather person was this principle. And this is science. So a man in the 60s went to a scientific conference, a really serious one, and he presented a paper with this title: "Can a flap of a butterfly's wing on the banks of the Amazon cause a tornado in Texas 5 days later?" And the answer is, yes it can. Yes it might. Not every time, but there's a possibility, because one thing we've learnt about the weather over the last 50 years is small things matter. Small changes have huge effects, and that's why weather forecasts go wrong all the time. If you're a weather person, you know sooner or later it's gonna go wrong, because we don't know everything and small things matter. And actually I hang on to that when I think about this issue of the environment, that small things matter. The small things that we can each do will mount up and make a difference. And I think that's the way God works in his kingdom sometimes. As Jesus says, you know, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Or if you want another example, think of the parable of the mustard seed, which grows into the biggest of trees, and birds of the air make their nest in it. Big things can come from small things. So the small things that we can each do, that each of our churches can do, actually can make a difference and can shape the agenda of our communities and our way of being disciples. So I hope something of what we've done this afternoon has been helpful in your thinking. You'll take that away and think some more about this in your own local churches. But thanks for sharing, thanks for joining in, and thanks for choosing to come.
Thank you.
It's been good to see you.